Before air conditioning, staying cool wasn't easy. There were no fans, no cold air, and no quick fixes. Medieval peasants had to deal with heat every day, with nothing to help but their own habits. Here's how they got through the hottest months. And it all started with the one place they spent the most time. Medieval peasant houses were built like ovens with doors. These homes used wattle and daub construction, which meant weaving thin branches together and covering them with mud, clay, and animal dung. Building with poop was apparently considered normal back then, which tells you everything you need to know about medieval home improvement standards. The walls were thick and heavy, made from rough stones mixed with wooden beams that came from whatever trees grew nearby. While this sounds strong, it created homes that soaked up heat during the day and refused to let it escape at night. The roofs caused the biggest problems. Thatched roofs made from dried grass, reeds, or straw were terrible at keeping heat out. These roofs were thick and dense, which meant they absorbed the sun's warmth like a giant sponge and then slowly released it into the house all day and night. The thatch also provided luxury penthouses for rats, birds, and bugs who probably left better reviews than the human tenants living below. Most peasant homes had floors made of packed dirt or clay that had been stomped down by countless feet over many years. During hot weather, these floors became scorching and turned into dust clouds that made breathing difficult. Having a dirt floor in summer was like living on top of a giant heating pad that never turned off. Windows were tiny when they existed at all. Many peasant homes had no glass windows because glass cost too much money and was hard to make. Instead, they used wooden shutters that could be opened during the day to let in some air. But opening shutters during summer meant letting in hot air, dust, and flying insects. Keeping them closed meant trapping stale, heated air inside. Either way, you were choosing between being roasted or being choked. The lack of proper airflow was made worse because most peasant homes were small, cramped spaces. Whole families lived in single rooms that were usually no bigger than a modern closet. When you packed 6 to 8 people into such a tiny space, body heat alone could make the temperature unbearable. It was like a medieval sauna that nobody asked for. Chimneys were expensive luxuries that most peasants could not afford. Instead, smoke from cooking fires escaped through holes in the roof or through open doors and windows. This meant that hot smoke filled the house before finding its way outside. These smoke holes were basically medieval air conditioning, except instead of cool air, they pumped in more heat and the occasional bird. Peasant homes were often built close together in villages, which meant there was little room for air to move between buildings. The narrow paths and alleys between houses created blocked areas that trapped hot air instead of letting it flow freely. Living in these homes during summer was like being trapped inside a bread oven that someone forgot to turn off. But dealing with sweltering homes was only part of the challenge peasants faced during summer heat. Medieval peasants dressed like they were preparing for winter even when the summer sun was blazing overhead. Their clothing choices were decided by what they could afford and what was available, not by comfort or staying cool. Most peasants wore wool garments year-round because wool was the most common fabric they could make or buy, and having different wardrobes for different seasons was a luxury they could not afford. The basic outfit for a male peasant included a linen shirt worn next to the skin, covered by a wool tunic that reached somewhere between the waist and knees. Over this, they often wore a wool cloak, especially when working outside. Basically, they were wearing 3 layers in weather that would make modern people want to walk around in their underwear. Women faced even greater challenges. They wore long linen undergarments beneath wool dresses that covered them from neck to ankles. The dresses were usually loose to allow movement during work, but they still trapped heat and stopped air from moving around the body. On top of this, married women had to cover their heads with linen veils or wool coverings, adding another layer of heat. The linen undergarments were the only relief from summer heat, but even these caused problems. Linen was cooler than wool, but it was still heavy fabric compared to modern standards. More importantly, linen cost a lot of money and was hard to clean, so most peasants owned only 1 or 2 linen pieces that they wore repeatedly without washing. Wearing the same sweaty undergarment for weeks was like wrapping yourself in a damp, heated blanket. Wool had some good points. It lasted a long time, stayed somewhat warm when wet, and could be made locally. But wool in summer was torture. The thick fibers trapped body heat and sweat, creating a constant feeling of being wrapped in a hot, wet cover. The wool used by peasants was rough and scratchy, not the soft wool we know today. Washing garments was a huge job that happened only a few times each year. Peasants had to carry water, heat it over fires, and scrub clothes by hand using harsh soaps made from animal fat and ash. The process took a whole day and needed good weather for drying. As a result, people wore their garments until they were literally falling apart, building up layers of sweat, dirt, and smells that made the heat even more unbearable. Most peasants owned only 2 or 3 sets of garments total. This meant wearing the same outfit for weeks or months before switching to a slightly different version of the same heavy, hot clothes. The idea of summer clothes and winter clothes was as strange to them as the idea of flying horses. A few months ago, I had no idea what a health ring even was until my fiancée got me one, and I have to say, I'm shocked this isn't a widely known and used product. It tracks my stress levels, and what I found out is that some supplements made my stress score spike, while others actually helped bring it down. I adjusted a few things based on that, and honestly, I feel 10 years younger. My wife mainly uses it to track her menstrual cycles, and she is obsessed with her sleep quality score. I noticed they are currently running a limited 69% discount, but I don't know how long it will last. It's currently only $60, and it's clear. This one is the best bang for your buck, with other health rings priced around $350 with less functions. They managed to price it this low because they cut out the middleman like Amazon, Walmart, etc., who drive up the price and take a big margin, ending up with the customer paying 3 to 5 times more. If you are on TV, you can check it out yourself by pausing the video and scanning the QR code with your phone camera or clicking the first link in the description of this video. Footwear was another source of heat and discomfort. Leather shoes cost too much and often did not fit right. So many peasants went barefoot during summer. Walking on hot dirt roads and sun-baked fields without shoes was painful, but it was often more comfortable than wearing thick leather boots that trapped heat and moisture. The social rules around dressing made it impossible to adapt to hot weather. Removing layers in public was considered improper, especially for women. Even peasants were expected to maintain certain standards of dress when they were around other people. Taking off your outer tunic because of heat was like showing up to church in your night clothes. Possible, but socially disastrous. But even with all these clothing challenges, medieval peasants found creative ways to beat the heat when it became too much to bear. When summer heat became unbearable, medieval peasants had to get creative with cooling methods that would make modern people realize just how lucky we are. These were not fancy techniques based on science. They were desperate actions born from necessity and handed down through generations of people who knew what it felt like to slowly cook in their own homes. The most popular cooling trick was simply moving somewhere else. When houses became too hot, whole families would leave their homes and sleep outside under the open sky. This was not fun camping. It was survival. People would drag straw beds, blankets, and pillows outside and make temporary sleeping spots in their yards, gardens, or even in village streets. Sleeping outside was like moving from a frying pan to the ground next to the frying pan. Not perfect, but definitely better. Finding shade became a daily hunt. Peasants would plan their schedules around moving shadows, following patches of shade like thirsty travelers following water sources. Large trees were prime real estate during summer months. Oak, ash, and beech trees with thick leaf covers became informal meeting places where people would gather to escape the sun. The shade under these trees could be 10 to 15 degrees cooler than direct sunlight. Stone walls and buildings provided another source of cooling relief. The thick stone walls of churches, castles, and larger buildings stayed cooler than wood and clay structures. Peasants would lean against these walls, sit in their shadows, or even lie down on the ground next to them to soak up some of the coolness. Church interiors were especially popular because the thick stone walls and high ceilings created naturally cooler spaces. Water was the ultimate luxury for cooling, but it was often hard to find and not always clean. Rivers, streams, and ponds became gathering places where people would soak their feet, splash water on their faces, and even strip down for quick baths when nobody was watching. The village well was often the coolest spot in town because it was built over underground water that stayed at the same temperature all the year. peasants developed clever ways to use small amounts of water for maximum cooling effect. They would soak pieces of cloth in cold water and wrap them around their necks, wrists, or heads. The drying of the water would create a cooling effect that could last for an hour or more. Underground spaces offered the best cooling relief. Root cellars, storage holes, and even wells provided access to the naturally cool temperatures found below ground. The Earth several feet below the surface stays at a fairly constant temperature year-round, usually around 50 to 60 degrees. Peasants would climb down into these spaces during the hottest parts of the day. The most effective cooling method was often simply accepting that you were going to be hot and miserable, and trying to make the misery as small as possible. Medieval peasants developed a mental toughness that allowed them to function in conditions that would send modern people running for the nearest air-conditioned building. The search for coolness affected every decision peasants made during hot weather, including what they chose to consume. Medieval peasants ate meals that would make modern people question everything about their food choices, especially during summer when heat made every bite feel like punishment. The basic peasant diet consisted of foods that created heat, spoiled quickly, and required cooking over open fires that turned kitchens into furnaces. Eating hot soup on a 90-degree day was basically medieval self-torture disguised as lunch. Pottage was the foundation of peasant nutrition throughout the year, and summer was no different. This thick soup was made from whatever grains, vegetables, and scraps were available, usually barley, oats, onions, cabbage, and turnips. It was cooked in large iron pots over open fires, filling homes with hot steam and smoke. During summer, standing over a hot fire to stir pottage was like volunteering to work inside a volcano. Bread was another main food that created heat problems. Most peasants could not afford to have ovens in their homes, so bread was baked in shared ovens used by entire villages. These ovens were massive stone structures that were heated with wood fires until they reached temperatures hot enough to bake dozens of loaves at once. Eating medieval peasant bread in summer was like swallowing a heated brick that sat in your stomach for hours. Fresh food was expensive, and peasants could not afford to waste it, but summer heat made food preservation a constant battle. Vegetables from gardens had to be eaten quickly before they rotted, which meant consuming them at whatever temperature they happened to be, usually warm from sitting in the sun. Meat was preserved through salting, smoking, or drying, processes that created foods that were incredibly salty and dense. Salt pork, dried fish, and smoked meat were common peasant foods, but they made people thirsty and created body heat during digestion. Eating salty preserved meat on a hot day was like adding fuel to an already blazing fire. Ale was the main drink for peasants, consumed in amounts that would shock modern people. A typical peasant might drink 1 to 2 gallons of weak ale per day because it was safer than water and provided calories and nutrients. However, brewing ale required boiling water and grains, adding more heat to already hot homes and villages. Brewing ale in summer was like hosting a steam bath party that nobody wanted to attend, but everyone needed because they had to have something safe to drink. Water was often unsafe to drink because it came from sources that were polluted by human and animal waste. Wells, streams, and ponds were often located near outhouses, animal pens, and garbage areas. This meant that peasants could not simply drink water to stay hydrated during hot weather. The timing of meals was influenced by heat as much as by work schedules. The main meal of the day was usually eaten in the late morning or early afternoon, when the heat was already building, but before it reached its peak. This meant that people were eating their largest, hottest meal just as the temperature was becoming unbearable. It was like eating a holiday feast inside a sauna. Dairy products were especially problematic during summer. Milk, cheese, and butter spoiled quickly in hot weather, and there was no effective way to keep them cool. Fresh milk had to be consumed within hours of milking, and cheese making was a race against spoilage. Trying to make cheese in summer heat was like trying to build a snowman in a desert. Technically possible, but probably not worth the trouble. But despite these challenges with food and drink, peasants found ways to adapt their social activities and daily routines to cope with the blazing heat. Medieval villages transformed completely during summer as peasants fled their sweltering homes and turned public spaces into outdoor living areas. The social life of entire communities shifted outside, creating scenes that would look chaotic to modern eyes, but made perfect sense to people who were desperately trying to escape the heat. Village greens became the center of summer life. These central areas, usually patches of grass or dirt surrounded by houses and shops, were transformed into outdoor workspaces where entire families would spend their days. People would bring their tasks outside, spreading out materials for spinning, weaving, and other crafts under whatever shade they could find. The village green in summer looked like a giant outdoor factory where everyone was trying to get work done while slowly melting. Churches became unofficial cooling centers during summer months. The thick stone walls, high ceilings, and shaded interiors of churches provided some of the coolest spaces available to peasants. People would arrive early for services and stay long after they ended, finding excuses to spend time in the relatively cool interior. Public wells became major social hubs during hot weather. These were not just places to get water. They were community gathering spots where people could cool off, wash their hands and faces, and catch up on village gossip. The area around a well was often several degrees cooler than the surrounding village because of the underground water source. Rivers, streams, and ponds were transformed into public cooling areas where normal social rules were relaxed out of necessity. People would wade into water fully dressed, remove shoes and stockings to soak their feet, and even strip down for bathing when privacy allowed. Shade trees became prime real estate that was claimed early in the day and defended throughout the hot hours. Large oak, ash, and beech trees with thick canopies could accommodate dozens of people in their shade. Families would establish temporary camps under these trees, bringing cushions, blankets, and work materials to create outdoor living spaces. A good shade tree in summer was more valuable than silver, mainly because you could not sit under silver to escape the heat. Children had more freedom to adapt to the heat than adults. They would spend entire days outside, often naked or wearing only thin linen shirts, playing in mud puddles, splashing in streams, and finding cool spots that adults were too dignified to use. Taverns and alehouses adapted to summer heat by extending their operations outdoors. Wooden benches and tables were moved outside under whatever shade was available, creating outdoor dining areas that were cooler than the stuffy interiors. Taverns in summer were like medieval comfort zones. They did not actually cool you down, but they made you care less about being hot. The social dynamics of villages changed during summer heat. People who might normally keep to themselves were forced to seek out shared cooling areas, creating interactions that would not happen during cooler weather. Summer heat was like a medieval social mixer. It forced everyone to come together, whether they wanted to or not. But even with all these adaptations to public spaces and outdoor living, the biggest challenge remained getting enough rest. Medieval peasants had to completely reorganize their sleep patterns during summer, creating schedules that would confuse modern people but made perfect sense for those trying to survive without any form of cooling technology. Sleep became a strategic activity that required careful planning, flexible scheduling, and a willingness to abandon traditional ideas about when and where rest should happen. The basic problem was that peasant houses remained hot long after the sun went down. The thick walls, thatched roofs, and poor ventilation meant that buildings absorbed heat throughout the day and released it slowly during the night. Trying to sleep in a medieval peasant house during summer was like trying to take a nap inside a bread oven that someone had forgotten to turn off. Work schedules were completely reorganized around the heat. Peasants would wake up well before dawn, sometimes as early as 3 or 4 in the morning, to take advantage of the coolest hours of the day. They would work for several hours while the air was still cool from the night, then take a long break during the hottest part of the day, usually from late morning until late afternoon. This schedule created a natural rest period that was essential for survival. During the hottest hours of the day, typically between noon and 4 in the afternoon, entire villages would shut down. People would seek out the coolest places they could find and rest until the heat became bearable again. The medieval rest period was not a luxury. It was a matter of not collapsing from heat exhaustion. Sleeping arrangements became incredibly flexible during summer. Families would abandon their beds and sleep wherever they could find cooler conditions. Straw mattresses, blankets, and pillows were dragged outside to create sleeping areas in gardens, courtyards, and even in the middle of village streets. Medieval villages during summer nights looked like giant camping trips where everyone had forgotten to bring tents. The floors of peasant houses, which were usually packed earth or clay, became sleeping surfaces during hot nights. People would lie directly on the ground inside their homes because it was cooler than sleeping on raised beds or mattresses. Some peasants would even dig shallow depressions in their floors to create slightly cooler sleeping spots. Sleep quality was terrible during summer heat waves. People would doze fitfully for short periods, wake up sweating and uncomfortable, then try to find cooler spots or cooler positions. Medieval summer sleep was less like a good night's rest and more like a series of uncomfortable naps interrupted by desperate searches for cooler air. The concept of privacy almost disappeared during the hottest nights. Entire families would sleep in the same room or outdoor area, not because they wanted to be close together, but because they had to share whatever cool spots were available. Night shifts became common during harvest season and other periods of intense work. Peasants would work in shifts, with some people working during the cooler night hours while others slept, then switching roles during the day. Sleeplessness was probably the most common problem among medieval peasants during summer, though they did not have a word for it. They just called it another miserable hot night. The combination of heat, discomfort, and irregular schedules meant that many people were constantly tired during the summer months. Children adapted to summer sleeping patterns more easily than adults. They would sleep in shifts, taking naps during the day in whatever cool spots they could find, then staying up later in the evening when adults were trying to sleep. Morning routines were adjusted to take advantage of cool air. People would wake up before dawn not just to start work, but to enjoy the only comfortable hours of the day. The period from about 4 to 7 in the morning was often the only time when peasants could be truly comfortable, and they learned to treasure these brief hours of relief. Medieval peasants developed a level of heat tolerance that would amaze modern people, but even they had their limits. The combination of hot days, sweltering nights, and constant physical labor created conditions that tested human endurance to its breaking point. Yet somehow, they survived these brutal summers year after year, developing strategies and adaptations that allowed them to function in conditions that would send modern people running for the nearest air-conditioned building.